talk about the lymphatic system and the lymphoid organs and tissues. So let's start with just a quick overview, kind of cartoon on what is happening here.
Moby, you're leaking. Well, isn't energon fluid kind of hard to replace? You're welcome. Dear Tim and Moby, what is the lymphatic system? Sincerely, Joe. The lymphatic system is a network of tubes and organs that transports a certain kind of fluid throughout your body. Well, believe it or not, that fluid is called lymph. Lymph actually starts out as blood plasma, the liquid part of blood. Plasma is mostly water, with some glucose, proteins, and hormones mixed in. Blood is constantly pushing against the insides of our veins, arteries, and other blood vessels, like water moving through a garden hose. This blood pressure causes some plasma to leak out of the capillaries, the tiniest blood vessels. The plasma hangs out in the spaces between cells, where it absorbs their waste materials. Most of the plasma gets absorbed back into the capillaries, but what happens to the rest? The leftover plasma, along with all that cellular waste, is picked up by lymph capillaries. These tiny tubes join together to form lymph vessels, just like regular capillaries join together to form blood vessels. Once the plasma is inside the lymphatic system, it's known as lymph. The lymph travels through the vessels until it reaches a lymph node. Lymph nodes remove cellular waste and germs from the lymph. The purified lymph keeps moving and eventually gets absorbed back into the blood. Well, all that is a long way of saying that the lymphatic system removes waste and excess fluid from your tissues. Diseases of the lymphatic system often interrupt that process, causing swelling and painful fluid retention. And that's not all. The lymphatic system helps us digest food, too. When food is broken down in the small intestine, most of the nutrients are sent to the liver. But not fatty acids, the nutrients that come from natural fats. These are absorbed by lymph vessels in the walls of the small intestine. The fatty acids circulate with the rest of the body's lymph and eventually end up in your bloodstream, where they can reach the cells that need them. That's true. The lymphatic system helps you fight infections, too. Bacteria, viruses, and any other harmful invaders are absorbed by the lymphatic system and sent to the nearest lymphoid organ. These include the lymph nodes, bone marrow, the thymus, and the spleen. The lymphoid organs are like factories that churn out white blood cells, the key weapons of the immune system. These special cells attack and destroy the invaders that can make you sick. Well, no, I don't think robots need a lymphatic system. How about a good mechanic?
Okay, guys, so that kind of gives us an idea or an overview of the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system helps return fluid leaked from the blood vessels back to the blood, and essentially is composed of three parts. It's composed of a network of lymphatic vessels. This essentially, we normally use the term lymphatics for this. It also consists of lymph. From the video, we now know is basically fluid that's located in these vessels. And then it incorporates lymph nodes. And these are in place to help clean lymph. And so within the lymphatic system, we have lymphoid organs and tissues, and they help to provide structural basis of immunity by housing cells basically phagocytic cells or lymphocytes. The structures that help hold, or the structures and organs that help with housing these phagocytic cells and lymphocytes, are basically the spleen, the thymus, the tonsils, the lymph nodes, and basically other lymphoid tissue, which we're going to talk about later. And so this is basically the organ system that we're going to talk about that is going to help keep us well. So basically how all this works is that the lymphatic system is going to help return interstitial fluid and leaked plasma proteins back to the blood. Now, interstitial fluid, if you remember from the first semester and throughout the course of this semester, is that fluid that the tissue is bathed in, right? And so that's going to basically come back to blood via lymphatic vessels. These are otherwise known as lymphatics, right? And these are basically a very elaborate network of draining vessels. On average, lymphatic vessels circulate about 3 liters of interstitial fluid per day. Basically, once the interstitial fluid enters the lymphatics, it's called lymph. So once the interstitial fluid enters the lymphatics, right, then it equals lymph. And this is a one-way system. So this ensures that lymph is only flowing towards the heart. And we're going to talk about directions of this. These lymphatic or lymph vessels include both lymphatic capillaries and larger lymphatic vessels. So let's talk about basically the flow of the lymphatic system. So the transport system, how it goes. It starts with these highly permeable lymphatic capillaries here. And these are found between the tissue cells and the blood capillaries. Basically in that loose connective tissue area. So what happens is generally large molecules like proteins, really big proteins, are too large to enter blood capillaries, but they can easily pass into lymphatic capillaries. So that basically those type of molecules get pushed into lymphatic capillaries. And from there, the substances that go into the lymphatic capillaries go into what's known as the, and it is, should have a C right there. Actually, lymphatic should have nothing there. So basically, they go into the collecting lymphatic ducts. And then from there, that's going to carry the lymph to a larger area called the lymphatic trunk. And basically, the lymphatic trunk drains fairly large areas of the body and eventually empties the lymph back into the circulatory system through 2 areas. The thoracic duct, duct, which basically drains rest of the body, and the right lymphatic duct, which drains the right arm, right side of the head, neck, and thorax. So basically the right lymphatic duct is very kind of specific, and then the thoracic duct is going to drain the rest of the body, and all of this is going to end up flowing into the cardiovascular system. So let's look at how this basically looks here. And so if you see this, we basically have the heart up here. And you can see the heart is throwing, so these are the arteries, right? This is going away, so this is the systemic system, and it's going down into these capillary beds, and this is going to be close to the tissue here. And then basically these capillaries that are here will flow out and go back into the heart. And so if we blow this up here, you'll notice that you can see these lymph capillaries just kind of weeding and meandering its way around that tissue and around those capillaries. And so basically these lymphatic vessels are low pressure. They use the same mechanisms as veins to basically return lymph to the circulatory system, right? So they have the little structures that basically close behind the fluid as it passes through. And so it uses three main mechanisms to do this. Basically, skeletal muscle, compression, it uses pressure changes during breathing. And then it has valves to prevent backflow. And so that's how it's able to continuously move. And so if you look here, you'll notice that it comes in through here. Remember, these are more permeable than the capillaries, and are a little bit bigger too. So things like proteins and everything will flow back into this versus basically going into the blood capillaries. And then you can see as it goes through the blood capillaries, it's going to collect into these collecting lymphatic vessels here. So you can see that. And then those are going to flow into basically lymph nodes. And then you can see the lymph nodes all flow into lymphatic trunks, then the lymphatic duct. And then from here, essentially, you can see, and when we're talking about the lymphatic duct, we're talking about the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. And then from there, it goes into the central cardiovascular system. And so this kind of shows you the sequence and then how that flow of that material goes back in. So let's take a closer look at the actual vessels. So as we go, the very first thing that it's going to flow into is the lymphatic capillaries. These are blind-ended vessels that weave between the tissue and cells and the blood capillaries that we just saw. You don't see them in, you don't see them in bones, teeth, bone marrow, and the central nervous system. If you remember, the central nervous system uses cerebral spinal fluid for drainage. These guys are pretty similar to blood capillaries, but they're more permeable. Right? So they can take up larger stuff, right? They can take up proteins. They can take up cell debris. They can take up pathogens. They can even take up cancer cells. So basically, with that being said, they can act as a route for pathogens or cancer cells to actually travel throughout the blood. So when something metastasizes from one area to the next, they're using the lymphatic system to do so. Their increased permeability here to these guys are due to two things. They're basically due to the endothelial cells overlap. And so if you look here, you'll notice that you have one of these endothelial cells here and another one here. And then if you look really closely, they have that flap-like mini valve. So basically they form this one-way mini valve. If you look, these guys are actually anchored, these little flaps that are here. So whenever, because these guys are anchored, so many valves are anchored by collagen fibers to the actual matrix. So it can actually increase the extracellular fluid volume, opens, or increasing the extracellular volume will actually open mini valves even more. Extracellular fluid volume opens mini valves more. If the extracellular fluid decreases in that area, it actually causes the mini valves to close. Now, in this area, they can actually have what's called lacteals. And these are specialized lymph capillaries that are present in the intestinal mucosa. So here, these are a little different because this will actually allow us to absorb digested fats and deliver fatty lymph chyle to the blood. So this fatty lymph, CHYLE, to blood. So that's the beginning, and that's essentially how all this substance can get into lymphatic capillary so easily. Now from there, basically what we'll have is it'll go into larger lymphatic vessels. And these consist of collecting vessel trunks and ducts. They have structures and tonics similar to veins, except they have thinner walls with more internal valves. Oops. Two veins, but thinner walls, more valves, right? Collecting vessels in skin travel with superficial veins, but deep vessels travel with arteries. Now from there, you'll go from the lymphatic trunk. These are formed by unions of large collecting vessels, and they drain large areas of the body, right? So name for regions of body they drained. So they can be named something like the paired lumbar, paired bronchiomediastinal, paired subclavian, paired jugular, and single intestinal. Then, of course, we have one or two of the lymphatic ducts. You'll either have the right lymphatic or the thoracic duct. And so if you remember, what does the right, let me put that down here so it separates. The right drains what? Should be the right upper arm, right side of the head, and thorax. Right? And then the thoracic duct drains rest of body, right? And then basically you have the venous circulation, and it's right at the junction where it goes back into the circulatory system, right, of the internal jugular and then the subclavian veins. And so let's look at this on the picture. So we can see all of the major, so if you look, let's go. If you're coming out here, you know it's coming from somewhere over in the extremity of your body. It's going into basically the capillaries first, and then it's traveling over to the collecting lymphatic ducts. Now, when we're looking at the lymphatic ducts, or more so going into the lymphatic trunks, you can actually see them, and I have them labeled on here. That you can see you have the right lumbar trunk here and the left lumbar trunk. And as they go up, oops, this should be around. Here's the thoracic duct here, right, as it comes through. You can see here the left bronchiomediastinal trunk. You have the right bronchiomediastinal trunk. You have the left subclavian trunk here. You have the right subclavian trunk. You have the left jugular trunk and the right jugular trunk. Now, with these, a lot of times, is that whenever we're collecting into these trunks, you'll see the cisternae highlight. And basically, this is just an enlarged sac. So in about half of individuals, it can start this way, right? These one of the lymphatic ducts that it's draining into. But if you look here, right, you have the main lymphatic duct here, and then this should be up into and should go around this guy right here. Because everything that is on the right, as in the right subclavian and the right side of the head and the right thorax, is all going to basically drain here, and then the rest of the body drains here. So those are all the main lymphatic trunks and the lymphatic ducts in the body, and you should be able to identify those. It's pretty straightforward. Now let's talk about how lymph is transferred around. So this is a low pressure system. Like I said earlier, it's much like the venous system. Lymph is propelled by the same mechanisms as the venous system, and I talked about these earlier, right? We talked essentially that you have skeletal muscle compression that happens, you have pressure changes during breathing, and you have valves to prevent the backflow. And so in here, it even shows you the part of the body that is drained by each duct. So if you remember, the thoracic duct was here. And so you can see here, this area, so all of this is drained by the thoracic duct. Where if you see the right entrance to the right lymphatic, then you'll notice that all of this drains from here. And so all of this is important because basically within the system, or this lymph that is propelled, is basically a combination of fluid and organic molecules and cells. And so let's talk about when we go through here, you'll notice in all these different regions, these areas right here. And these are what are known as lymph nodes. And so lymph nodes help to basically help to cleanse the lymph that goes through here. And what we're going to do is we're going to look a little bit of how we do that. So, but how do we actually move lymph throughout the system? And so, as we talked about earlier, right, it's propelled by basically this milking action of skeletal muscles. By pressure changes that are in the thoracic region during breathing. Valves to prevent backflow. pulsations of nearby arteries, and basically contraction of smooth muscles and walls of the lymphatics. Now, physical activity can actually increase the flow of lymph. So sometimes having areas being immobile will keep needed inflammatory material in areas for faster healing. So when we're talking about trying to get things to be fixed or cleared out faster, it's important to kind of slow down and allow those areas to stay immobile so that the material that's there to help recruit white blood cells can stay there longer, and those particular molecules needed can essentially help you to heal faster. Now, some of the cells that we'll talk about that help with the lymphatic system are as followed. And those are what are known as lymphoid cells. And we've talked about a few already. Now, lymphoid cells consist of immune system cells that are found in lymphoid tissue and supporting cells that form lymphoid tissue structures, right? And so lymphocytes are one cell that we've already kind of talked about when we're talking about what we find in blood. And lymphocytes are cells of the adaptive immune system that we're going to talk more about what adaptive immunity is in our next lecture. And they mature into one of two main types of cells. And they can either be what are known as T cells or B cells. So this is basically T lymphocytes or B lymphocytes. T lymphocytes are important because they help to manage the immune response. And some also attack and destroy cells. B lymphocytes are important because they produce plasma cells. Plasma cells are important because they secrete antibodies, and antibodies are going to be what helps us later to detect antigens or those things that our body wants to warn us against. Now, these guys basically arise from the red bone marrow. Now, we're going to talk about how they mature in different places. For instance, the B cells basically mature in the bone marrow, but the T cells mature in the thymus. But they both arise from the same area. Now, other lymphoid cells that you can see are macrophages. These guys have a couple different jobs. They can help to eat or phagocyze foreign substances, or they can help activate T cells. Now, there are also what are known as dendritic cells. And these help to capture antigens and then deliver them to the lymph nodes. These are also help with T cell activation. And on top of other lymph node immunity cells, we can look at essentially reticular cells. So let's look at the next page here. If you see here, you can see the macrophage here, right? And so you can notice that you have these reticular cells that are on this reticular fiber. And so they basically are helpful because they produce, so the reticular cells produce this fiber called stroma. And this stroma is a scaffolding or network to supporting cells in the lymph node organ. So you can see that macrophages and other things will use those, or even lymphocytes here, right, to basically move around and attach to when they're in the lymph node organ. So that's a supported cell as well. And so that's where we're going to stop. And when we get started here in a second, we're going to start with lymph tissue.